Americans have elected a president for the 54th time in U.S. history. In this exercise of American democracy, the people invest awesome power in a single leader. And most presidents, on winning an election, claim they have a mandate from the people.
In their need, they have registered a mandate.
Let us ask for their help again to renew the mandate of 1980.
A mandate, mind you, to destroy the New Deal.
Your votes were a mandate, which I accept.
It is a mandate for unity.
But what does it mean when a president says he has won a popular mandate? Where does this idea come from? And what does it tell us about the relationship between the president and the people? The mysterious relationship between the president and the people, and the whole idea of the presidential mandate, has changed dramatically over the last 200 years.
The great drama of American history is the increasing democratization and responsiveness of the presidency as an institution of democracy. But the question of whether the modern presidency really is consistent with the founders' ideals and whether it has dangers as well as strengths is one that we have to think hard about.
One of the more vexing challenges for the delegates at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was the nature of the executive office. It was just 4 years after the War of Independence. The framers were driven by their distaste and distrust of anything resembling a monarchy. But they also knew the country needed leadership.
The framers had no idea of what they were doing when they invented the presidency. The fundamental problem was to design a government responsive to the deepest aspirations of the American people. After all, if they didn't think that that was the fundamental aspiration of their generation, they would have remained British.
They wanted an executive figure of independence and dignity, who would be a source for order, for stability, someone who would resist the temporary impulses of the people and look out for their long-term interests.
What they came up with during that long, hot summer of 1787 was not truly democratic. Though James Wilson argued vehemently for the direct popular election of the president, his idea was quickly voted down.
It's absolutely clear that the founding fathers, the people who wrote the Constitution, regarded democracy as a bad thing, and in many ways as an unmitigated disaster. They never used the word democracy to describe America. They used the word republic.
So the question for the framers is, how are we going to select a president in this republic? The answer is to select a few notables from each state and have each of these notables, who were more integrated into whatever little national political life there was, select a thoughtful person. That was their ideal.
The whole notion of the Electoral College would suggest that the democratic impulses of the people must be reined in, must be controlled in some kind of way. It would be better to devise an instrument that would do precisely this. And that's what the Electoral College is supposed to be. You let the people think that they have elected a president, when as a matter of fact, they have not.
2 years after the Philadelphia Convention, George Washington was elected the nation's first president, not by voters, but by the 69 men of the Electoral College.
When the delegates left Philadelphia, they had no idea of how the institution of the presidency was going to turn out. Much of its future lay in the hands of George Washington, how he conducted himself. And he went out of his way to be a Democratic president. He made a point, although it was a very arduous task that he set for himself, of traveling to visit each of these states to greet the people.
But Washington always saw himself as presiding over the people and avoided being swayed by them. Congress was the part of government that was to be democratic. The presidency was to remain above politics.
Washington is not a man who I think had ordinary social skills. He wasn't charismatic. He was awkward and shy. He was a wonderful commander and a capable administrator, but many found him very remote. He wasn't your usual democratic leader in the modern sense. On the other hand, he was the first president who was chosen, no doubt, because the people wanted him to be president.
And to prove he was not an elected king, George Washington voluntarily retired after 2 terms.
George Washington was a leader that the country couldn't do without. Wouldn't that be nice to be able to rely on a president, have a leader like that in office today?
During Washington's presidency, something happened that the founding fathers had frowned upon: the birth of political parties.
The framers dreaded the thought of development of political parties in this country, and yet by the time of the first election after George Washington, the country had 2 political parties that bear some resemblance to political parties as we know them today.
Over the next generation, the American people began insisting on a larger role in choosing the president. And in the 1820s, they had their way with the rise of a new kind of candidate, Andrew Jackson. Jackson ran against 3 other candidates in the election of 1824, and while he won the popular vote, he failed to win a majority in the Electoral College. Following procedures set down in the Constitution, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, which chose John Quincy Adams, who had come in second. From his home in Tennessee, Jackson said, "The voice of the people has been disregarded."
Between 1824 and 1828, there were major changes in the electoral system, and these were sparked by Jackson and his followers, who made changes at the state level. And these changes involved the selection of presidential electors by the people rather than by state legislatures.
Jackson ran again in 1828, and this time he was elected by a huge outpouring of voters, 4 times as many as had ever voted before. A new era of democratic politics had begun.
In 1828, the people spoke, and they spoke through the electorate, and now they have their own president. And you could see that with a popular reaction to him. They came to the White House on the inauguration day and almost took over. He was a people's president in a very special and a very unusual and a very new way.
As president, Jackson claimed bold new executive powers that he exercised in what he said was the people's interest. When Congress voted to recharter the National Bank, which Jackson believed was corrupt and undemocratic, he vetoed the bill, something no president had ever done except on constitutional grounds.
What you begin to see in presidential history is that the great force of the presidency tends to be a negative force. It's a kind of sweeping out the old, a kind of repudiation of the prior order of things, an outright dismantling of the institutions that supported the politics of the past, like the National Bank.
In 1832, Jackson ran for re-election, vowing that if he won a second term, he would close down the bank for good. When he easily won the popular vote and an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College, he said democracy had spoken. He was the first president to claim a mandate from the people.
From that day on, Jackson felt that he was speaking for the people, and that it was not the Congress and not the court that was speaking for the people. He, the president, was speaking for the people. They spoke through him, and therefore there was vested in him the power of the people.
Jackson says the election of the president has decided the issue. And that's the pivotal moment when you move to these claims of a presidential mandate from an election to take certain actions.
Andrew Jackson is usually seen as the figure most responsible for democratizing the presidency in the 1820s and 30s. And yet, what Jackson was creating was a white man's democracy. And he was, at the same time, the president most responsible, for example, for Indian removal. So this tension between serving the majority and being responsive to and protective of minority rights has been an enduring dilemma of the American presidency.
The idea of the mandate for the people has no relationship to the original understanding of the American Constitution. This new idea transforms the presidency into this tremendous democratic dynamo, which on the one hand expresses the wishes and will of the American people, and on the other hand, of course, it's a potential dictator, which is going to get us into trouble when we get to Abraham Lincoln.
I believe that the word of one person is more than the words of few. If he's not strong, then how are you going to lead the people?
We need a president such as the great Abraham Lincoln.
The election of 1860 was a momentous one. With new winner-take-all rules, the front-runner won all the electoral votes in a given state. With 4 candidates in the race, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican known for his opposition to slavery, won the election with less than 40% of the popular vote.
Lincoln was powerfully disliked by probably the majority of the American people. He had to earn the confidence of the country.
As soon as Lincoln gets elected as this dramatic minority president, this long suppressed issue of the status of slavery, which men of goodwill have been trying to push to the periphery so the country won't fall apart, is now at the center. And given the precedence of Andrew Jackson, the fact that Lincoln is now in the White House means that the South has reason to be concerned.
The concern was that Lincoln would claim a mandate to end slavery. And so by the time of his inaugural in March 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union. But Lincoln didn't claim a popular mandate. Instead, referring to his constitutional duty to ensure that the laws be faithfully executed, he assumed unprecedented presidential powers. He prosecuted the war without congressional approval. He instituted harsh penalties for deserters from the Army, and in a crackdown on agitators and suspected spies, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus.
There's no more foundational right in a free society than habeas corpus, the right not to be held arbitrarily by the government. And he also instituted military tribunals and suspended, in many areas, the civil courts. Those actions were extremely controversial. One might say that the most dangerous presidents are our good presidents, because they set precedents for expansive power that those with a more dangerous character can take advantage of.
In many ways, Lincoln overreached. Here is a man who suspends habeas corpus, who many people think has assumed dictatorial powers. But what Lincoln had, which was so important at the moment he had the presidency, was a kind of an inner steel that said to him, the Union will be preserved, and it will be preserved at any cost.
Though Lincoln's priority was to preserve the Union, he knew that slavery was at the root of the crisis. Here was the flaw in America's democracy. An anti-democratic principle at the heart of the Constitution, in direct contradiction to the Declaration of Independence. As the Civil War continued and the casualties mounted, Lincoln explored ways to end slavery on legal grounds.
Lincoln always understood slavery as inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence, and he understood the Declaration as a statement of the highest American morality, the principles that were the basis of all good in this country. So to free the slaves while saving the Union was an ideal mix, although, of course, it was politically very difficult.
No president could have dismantled an institution as ingrained as slavery was without first convincing the public that it was the right thing to do. And that required true democratic leadership.
Lincoln understood where he was going. but he knew he couldn't get too far ahead of the people. That's what he meant when he said we're to realize these ideals as fast as circumstances allow. And the Civil War was a massive change of circumstances. It allowed a lot of development very rapidly.
The Battle of Antietam on northern soil brought Lincoln a surge of popular support, which he used as his opportunity to act. On September 23, 1862, 5 days after the Union victory there, he issued an emergency measure aimed at crippling the Confederate war effort, the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
If you held a Gallup poll at that time and asked white people, North and South, should we emancipate the slaves, I don't know what the answer would have been. So here we have this very awe-inspiring and perplexing precedent of the president acting unilaterally in the name of we the people as commander-in-chief, doing something which probably the country wasn't prepared for.
The Emancipation Proclamation declared it the president's right in wartime to attack the institution of slavery. It called on Confederate slaves to rise up against their masters, and it invited them to cross enemy lines to join the Union Army.
Once black troops showed by their courage and commitment their dedication to their freedom and to the nation, it was all the more Lincoln's view that the meaning of the war came down to emancipation.
On November 19, 1863, at Gettysburg, Lincoln spoke to the American people. He committed the country to a new kind of democracy, invoking a set of ideas as shining and original as those in the Declaration of Independence.
Of the people, by the people, for the people. What's so profound about it is that it both expressed his constitutional vision as well as his moral one. Lincoln's great achievement shows that presidents can nudge and can exhort and can challenge and can slowly make clear moral principles that perhaps hadn't initially been obvious. But he can never be heedless of public opinion.
By 1864, public opinion had turned against Lincoln. Those who opposed emancipation and the endless war had gained support, and Lincoln's bid for a second term seemed doomed.
1864, things aren't looking too good for Lincoln. He could have said, well, you know, it's a war. That's what Winston Churchill did, and during the Second World War, there were no elections in Britain till after the war. But he didn't, even though it wasn't at all clear to him that he was going to win.
Lincoln's feeling about the election was that it had to be held to see what the people think, and for very simple but obvious reasons, which is if you don't hold these elections that are really the foundation of the whole system, then in effect you don't have the Constitution, and that's worth fighting for in the first place.
The absolutely crucial act was to insist on regular elections. And he puts his proposed 13th Amendment, which transforms this wartime Emancipation Proclamation into something that promises to be the law of the land, in the platform of the Republican Party, and he wins.
He won the election of 1864 decisively, with 55% of the popular vote, and swamped his opponent in the Electoral College. It was not until now that Lincoln claimed a mandate from the people. A mandate to pursue the constitutional end of slavery.
When Lincoln wins re-election, he calls a special session of Congress. Congress had failed to pass the 13th Amendment, and he calls them back into session saying, you know, again, a mandate claim. You know, the people have spoken on this, and now's the time to act, and he gets them to do it.
No president had ever sponsored a constitutional amendment. That had been Congress's domain.
In a remarkable act, unprecedented, Abraham Lincoln signs the proposed 13th Amendment. And it's just at this moment when Lincoln signs the 13th Amendment before it goes out for ratification that he's signifying a great transformation in the status of presidential leadership.
The 13th Amendment, which he gleefully signed, he said, this wraps the whole thing up. It's remarkable that Lincoln participated in bringing about the changes that he did. The evolving view of Lincoln can be regarded as the maturing of the Union and of the nation with respect to the status of African Americans in the Union.
Democratic leadership is leadership that does not simply seek power for the possessor, but seeks power in the name of furthering democratic ends, whether those ends are the inclusion of groups that have been left out of the democracy, whether they are a recognition of the dignity of ordinary people, whether they are a commitment to educating people. And really, in the story of the presidency and democracy, Lincoln is the supreme character. No one else has taught Americans as much by his life and by his words what it means to be a democratic leader.
After Abraham Lincoln, the presidency went into a period of decline. Andrew Johnson was impeached. Ulysses S. Grant was engulfed by scandal. And in 1876, in an electoral crisis, Rutherford B. Hayes was named president after losing the popular vote. By the time of Benjamin Harrison, who closeted himself away in the White House, some experts were predicting the demise of the presidency itself. But then came Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't claim a mandate in so many words. What he did say was he was a steward of the people.
It's hard to exaggerate the importance of Theodore Roosevelt to the growth of the American presidency. We think of Jefferson, of Jackson, of Lincoln, and yet after all of the development of the presidency, William McKinley, who immediately preceded Theodore Roosevelt, had a total staff of 1 secretary and 6 clerks. He ended his White House day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and napped. And then Theodore Roosevelt comes in, and he's an absolute tornado of energy.
Theodore Roosevelt invents what we consider the modern presidency. That is, he invents a presidential office that has a direct relationship, a direct personal relationship with the American people. And much of his time in office was dedicated to establishing that vital link.
One way he did that was by personalizing his presidency, showing off his large family through the new mass-market newspapers. He was our first media-savvy president.
Well, I think Teddy Roosevelt was the first person to pioneer the notion of a president who was larger than life and accessible and funny. He was the first president who was a celebrity, as well as being a president.
But it was Woodrow Wilson, a former professor and university president, who revived the idea of the popular mandate. The first president in over a century to address Congress in person, he insisted he alone represented all the people. However, he was often seen as arrogant and was criticized for moving too far ahead of popular opinion. After World War I, Wilson tried to build a popular mandate for America's entry into the League of Nations by going on a nationwide speaking tour.
Well, it was too little too late. After Wilson had been unconcerned about public opinion, unconcerned about the Senate's opinion, he then goes on this last desperate attempt to rally the public. But in many ways, the public felt he hadn't been talking to them about this for months. The Senate was incensed that he was trying to do an end run around them. And so the whole thing collapsed in failure. Wilson is a perfect example of a leader who perhaps was too aloof and too determined he was going to lead, forgot he had to take the country along with him.
No president ever worked harder to take the country along with him than Franklin Roosevelt, the president of the Great Depression.
In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days.
When FDR took office, we were in perhaps the most dire straits that the United States has ever been in. A full fourth of the workforce was unemployed. Those people had no backup resources. There was no kind of a welfare state. There was physical unrest. Farmers were picking up their shotguns to keep their farms from being repossessed.
It's a desperate time. And above all, there is a feeling of fear in the country. They'd gone through 1929, 30, 31, 32. Some feared that the Depression would never end. And Franklin Roosevelt comes in with that inaugural address with such confidence.
The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action.
Unregulated capitalism, FDR said, had helped bring about the Great Depression. As he saw it, his mandate was to recast the American system, making it fairer, more equitable, and more responsive to the people.
What we have is the legitimation of activist government in the name of the American people. That's really a revolution in the governing philosophy of the United States.
Roosevelt's goal is to give people a sense that their governmental system, that the American Constitution and American government can work. It's not stuck with the old solutions. It can find new solutions of its own.
To reach out to the American people and explain his program, Roosevelt used the new medium of radio. He was able to enter the living rooms of ordinary Americans in what became known as his fireside chats.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next step
in a democracy. The most important thing that you need to do if you're President of the United States is communicate with people in terms that they can understand. That doesn't mean talking down to the folks. It means talking to them. And Franklin Roosevelt did that more effectively than any president in the era of mass communications because the words were so plain and so beautiful.
I assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress.
I speak from personal experience now. I was living through the New Deal years. Roosevelt was able to make you feel that he was talking to you and no one else. He could really wrap you in his confidence. And it was in that way that he was able to convey to you the sense that he was your president, looking out for you. This is a remarkable talent.
You can't lead American democracy unless you love American democracy. You have to have an essentially sunny faith in the ability of people, when properly led and informed, to do the right thing. And this was Roosevelt's achievement. Franklin Roosevelt inspired people to be something better than themselves. He challenged people to transcend their fears rather than pandering to them at every turn. He reflected public opinion, but he led it, and in the process, he transformed American democracy.
To gauge popular support for his New Deal programs, Roosevelt was soon pioneering the use of public polling. Polling had actually begun in the era of Andrew Jackson, when straw polls were used to test public opinion in the 1824 election. By the 1880s, mass circulation newspapers began surveying their readers. And in 1935, George Gallup, a professor of journalism, invented a system of scientific polling. It was Franklin Roosevelt who installed the first White House pollster, and the polls were soon showing deep support for the New Deal.
Of 1929 showed up the despotism for what it was. And the election of 1932 was the people's mandate to end it, and under that mandate, it is being ended.
By the mid-1930s, FDR was in need of a renewed mandate. So he threw himself into his campaign for re-election in 1936. Roosevelt was well aware that of the first 31 presidents, only 10 had won a second term.
I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you.
In the 1936 election, FDR carries all but 2 states, and he is at the height of his power. But there's one thing that troubles him, and that is that the Supreme Court has struck down more pieces of legislation in his first term than at any other time in history before or since.
Emboldened by his re-election, Roosevelt overreached in 1937. To soften opposition to his New Deal program, he proposed an increase in the size of the Supreme Court so he might add new judges sympathetic to his cause. But Congress, sensing he was overstepping his mandate, blocked his way, reminding the public that the legislature and the courts are also key institutions of democracy.
The judges on the old court were performing a fundamental function in American democracy. They were putting the American people on notice that this president was not only saying he had a mandate, but actually was using this mandate for truly revolutionary purposes. And presidents oughtn't be able to do that just overnight. Just as Abraham Lincoln, once he's issued the Emancipation Proclamation, had to struggle for several years to get a mandate, so too it was a good thing for Franklin Roosevelt's initial program in the New Deal to meet with resistance and force him to go back to the American people, election after election, to get the kind of democratic mandate that you need to really change the governing philosophy of the United States. The distinctive thing about Roosevelt is that he did it.
His greatness stems, at least in part, from his confidence that this government can respond, that this government can do something. Government has social and economic responsibilities, not simply responsibilities to preserve a free market, but responsibilities to maintain a certain level of social welfare.
Franklin Roosevelt's key insight was that the presidency is primarily a position of moral leadership. It's an atmospheric thing, it's an intangible, but it is the heart and soul of the presidency.
So what about this idea of the popular mandate? Skeptics have called it a dangerous myth that presidents can use to run roughshod over the will of the people. Others warn that mandates are rarely as broad or sweeping as presidents often claim. But the idea of the mandate is rooted in American history and will certainly be invoked for years to come. And as our greatest presidents have shown, mandates can be genuinely earned in a give-and-take process that deserves the name democratic leadership.
Well, we've always had a hard time reaching an understanding about whether the President of the United States ought to reflect the attitude of the American people or ought to be leading the American people. And I don't think we're ever going to resolve that kind of issue. The truth is that we want both things to happen.
I think Jimmy Carter exemplifies one who is concerned with the world and who is concerned with humanity.
He should be tough.
Kennedy, or Clinton, Kennedy especially. I liked, what was that one, the famous one that was a star in the movie, Reagan.
I believe that Harry S. Truman is one of our best presidents because I feel he was very honest with the American people.
Bill Clinton seemed to be more into the people and just a little bit more easygoing.
Well, let's see. Lincoln